Now, new and exciting technologies will always be challenging and will be difficult to understand until its meaning is made clear. Now, in October 2021, the National Department of Agriculture, Land Reform and Rural Development announced that a diverse and evolving group of products derived from new breeding technologies, or NBTs, will be evaluated under the risk assessment framework that exists for genetically modified organisms, or GMOs, under the Genetically Modified Organisms Act 1997, Act 15 of 1997. And now I have to take a deep breath because that was very complex. Now, South Africa's decision to regulate all of these products derived from NBTs as GMOs will have widespread implications, not only in South Africa and for South African innovations, but also with regards to international trade of commodities, of course, that may contain products derived from NBTs. Now, at the end of November, the agricultural industry lodged an appeal under Section 19 of the GMO Act, particularly in support of the South African bioeconomy and local innovation, and is looking forward to furthering communication regarding the next steps in this process. Now, to discuss this issue with me, I have Chantel Arendse from CropLife.
Afternoon, thank you.
And Theo Boshoff, the CEO of AgriXtra. I want to jump away with a first question and ask, what are these new breeding techniques? Chantel, how are they different from GMOs?
Okay, so new breeding techniques are a set of diverse tools that emerged, I think, in the last 10 years or so. And these are tools that enable, the breeding process to be accelerated and more advanced, in that they enable specific changes to be made to the genomes, the native genomes of plants and animals, and to obviously lead to improved and desirable traits in those plants and animals. And the difference with genome editing techniques, unlike GMOs, they allow these changes to be made, within the plant's own or animal's own genome. So there's no need for external DNA. So when it comes to GMOs, on the other hand, it involves the introduction of desirable traits through the insertion of an additional piece of DNA. And the most well-known example are your BT maize. And with BT maize, the external piece of DNA comes from Bacillus thuringiensis, which is the bacterium, which gives the plant, the inherent immunity against targeted pests. So this external DNA is not a requirement when it comes to the applications of new breeding techniques for crop improvement or improvements in organisms in general.
So I take it that is why industry is not in favor of NBTs being regulated as GMOs. Am I right?
That's correct, because when it comes to GMOs, it takes a lot of investment costs. It takes a lot of time, from concept to coming out with a product in the end. And by subjecting all applications of NBT innovators to these extensive, investment costs up front, because of the way it's going to be regulated under the GMO Act. And also importantly to note that some of the outcomes of NBT technologies do not result in GMOs. They actually mimic the processes of conventional breeding or natural changes that take place in plants in nature over time. So, the products or the outcomes of NBTs are comparable to conventionally bred products. And so we feel that just subjecting it to GMOs would be, it would hinder innovation and also access to the technology in South Africa.
Yeah, now, so industry has already lodged an appeal against this. What are some of the main issues that this appeal is challenging?
Okay, so if I may take that one. So it's important that it's an industry-wide appeal, not just specifically the companies that are involved with these new plant breeding techniques. And the importance of that is exactly because of the downstream impact it can have on the industry, the wider agricultural industry, the wider agribusiness industry. If you look at South Africa, and our agricultural economy, generally speaking, we're very exposed to the rest of the world. We're integrated in a globalized economy. And if you look at the other countries around the world, you have the likes of, especially the EU, where it's highly subsidized and they maintain their competitiveness through subsidies. South Africa can be more classified sort of in the same group as, say, the Kearns group, where Australia, New Zealand, Brazil, Argentina, these are all countries with relatively lower agricultural potential and very, very low subsidies. So to remain competitive for the broader sector, access to the latest biotechnology is absolutely vital. So firstly, so I think it's important just to outline, that's the reason why it's not simply the companies themselves, but the whole agriculture value chain that has an interest, in this outcome. So some of the challenges, I think first of all, as far as GMOs are concerned, GMOs are regulated, and rightfully so. There's a GMO Act that must be regulated, but it must be rational. There must be a rational link between that which you regulate and the inherent dangers or risks it poses. And I think, as Chantel explained now, the important aspect of it, where it's not fundamentally and internationally regarded as a GMO, to regulate it as a GMO can have very adverse impacts on the accessibility, the availability of technology, and of course the cost involved in that.
Now, you've been talking about our farmers' ability to compete in the markets out there. Now, technology, I think, plays a huge role in making us more competitive. But let's look at the production side of it. What would be the implications of this decision on our South African farmers' ability to just produce food? When we look at things like climate change, for instance, and the climatic conditions we have in South Africa, what is the widespread impact of this decision on our farmers' abilities?
Okay, so our farmers have fortunately enjoyed success with GMO technology for the last 20 or 30 years or so. And that has contributed, without a doubt, to yield increases. And with this decision, it's going to make it a little bit harder not impossible, but definitely harder for the technology to reach the farmers, sooner rather than later. And, it's not just about the farmers here. You want them to be competitive with their counterparts in other major producing areas as well. And to remain competitive, they need to have access to those technologies. So by regulating it, with this decision, regulating all NBTs as GMOs, you're subjecting them to stricter regulations. There's going to be reluctance to actually want to bring the technology to South Africa just because of the costs and the time involved in getting a product, approved. And so, might be not now or next year, but going forward, our farmers are going to need access to all the tools in the toolbox. And, it's not going to become easier going forward in terms of, production challenges and climate and so on. So, yeah, it's definitely not good news for our farmers. And, yeah, the decision is definitely not going to help.
If I could maybe just add on to that, because South Africa is one of the most climate-exposed countries in the world, already about the 30th driest country, and all indications are that adverse weather conditions, especially a drier western side, perhaps a more tropical but volatile eastern side, climate change is very real in South Africa. So certainly the biotech, we definitely need to invest in biotech and have, as Chantal mentioned, a friendly environment to attract biotech. Because globally speaking, South Africa is a very small player in terms of agriculture. So these large, especially multinational companies that operate in multiple jurisdictions, you have to make it attractive for them to bring the products to South Africa, considering we're a very, very small percentage of the world market. But for our local domestic industry, access to the biotech is vitally, vitally important.
Yeah, it's true. When Chantel made the point about attracting all these technologies to South Africa, I was thinking of stuff like international trade as well. How does this decision in South Africa, does it differ from international policies regarding NBTs? And then, of course, we have to talk about international commodities, international trade. How will that impact our importing of international foodstuffs, for instance?
Okay. The global trend, I would say, that is emerging when it comes to regulation of NBTs is countries like Argentina, Brazil, the US, Australia. The trend there is to actually differentiate NBTs from GMOs. So they do not regulate it the same. They regard regulation towards NBTs more as a conventional product. And so now you need to understand that if the regulatory approval for NBTs, is divergent from what we have in South Africa, what does that mean for trade? Because now a product that is not a GMO in Argentina or the US is traded with South Africa, where it is regarded as a GMO. What does that hold in terms of marketing, labeling requirements, and all of, it just makes it a mess in terms of how do you deal with it. So South Africa is definitely an outlier in terms of the way the rest of the world is viewing NBTs and the path that they are taking towards regulating NBTs.
And I can just imagine the impact that it has on our local guys. Local ideas, local solutions. And now we are almost putting a block, I almost want to say, in front of this innovation, in front of this new development. How will that have an impact on local solutions when it comes to NBTs?
Okay, so I think, if I could jump in, Theo. I think that, when it came to plant biotech GMOs, traditional GMOs, I mean, those products that we have use of in South Africa are mostly, in the hands of the multinationals. And when it comes to NBTs, it's more of, it is cheaper to use, it's easier to use, and it's more accessible, I would say, for anybody to use as an application. And so, it's, what do they call it? It's democratizing technology. So meaning, it's better suited for local innovation to come up with local solutions to our problems. So it's not just limited to multinationals. It broadens the scope of who can access the technology and who can actually use it to produce local products that address our local, the local challenges we have.
If I can maybe just add, because it's important to note, I mean, as you mentioned, if these NBTs have to go through the process of being registered as a GMO, they're branded as a GMO, so that obviously has the reputational, implications, which are very severe. But it's also worth mentioning, if I just listen to Chantel talking about how the technology has evolved, the GMO Act is more than 20 years old. So the concept of what's a GMO now could be very different to what a GMO was 20 years ago. And that's part of the basis of this appeal, is that the interpretation of that act has to allow some flexibility. It all comes down to the definition of what is a GMO. If it's a GMO, it falls under this act. If it's not, then it's not. But the definition the interpretation has to evolve as the science catches up and as GMOs become more used and more developed, as well as these NBTs that are not GMOs in the rest of the world.
Why did legislators not keep up?
Well, the legislative process is very slow. Let me put it that way. It's fundamentally an act has to go through a long consultation process. So there has to be some scientific reason in this instance, to amend it from the outset. Then, of course, it has to go through rounds of public consultation with key stakeholders. It has to be gazetted for public comments. These comments need to be considered, consultations held. Ultimately, then it goes to National Parliament, who has to make the decision to vote on it or not. So that is a long and tedious process. But it's for that reason that it's very important, where there's ambiguity in legislation, that has to be interpreted correctly. And one mustn't write your legislation as if, for that reason, it's going to apply for 5 years. You need to have that foresight in terms of the way you write legislation to allow future generations and future regulators and the courts, of course, that ultimately will adjudicate whether something is a GMO or not, or interpreting legislation, to have that flexibility. And looking at the current legislation and the definition, and this is part of the basis of the appeal, is it's almost being applied, we believe, perhaps too simplistically, to say it's a GMO, has to go through the process. But there's various legal interpretations that could provide room to interpret within the existing law, without amending the law, for it to not be regarded as a GMO. And part of the appeal process and part of the outcomes we sought is it's not a hostile approach between industry and government. It's a collaborative approach. Yes. So I say if there is a problem in the legislation, we don't necessarily think there has to be, but let's jointly approach a court, get a declaratory order, get someone with authority to indicate whether or not the definition is a challenge, whether you even have to amend the legislation, because first prize would be not amending it. Yeah. But if there is reasonable scientific evidence and it affects the industry so much that an amendment has to take place, then it's good to also kickstart that process.
I think we should also always keep in mind who it is that we produce our food for, and that's of course the consumer. I mean, that's the end product. How will this strict regulatory approach potentially affect the consumer in South Africa?
Okay, so consumers have always also indirectly, I would say, benefited from having access to affordable, safe and nutritious food. And with the applications of this technology, some of the applications are directed specifically at consumers, making sure that they also have nutritious food. So, things like already that's maybe not on the market yet, but definitely in the research pipeline. Gluten-free wheat, tackling allergies. Also foods like blood pressure reducing tomatoes, believe it or not. I mean, it's already on the market in Japan. And soybean with reduced unhealthy fats. So these are things that speak to consumers as well, and it has already been developed with NBT technology. And so, surely we do not want to lag behind and be excluded, from what the benefits from what the rest of the world is enjoying. So definitely, it's the technology is, applications, I would say. It's not just, the benefits to farmers are obvious. But definitely, there is also a shift in the direction of what do our consumers need, what do they value, and to address those values as well.
But perhaps just, if I may add on to that, the converse as well, and the risk associated with that is, even though, Chantel will be able to tell you that the detail better than I, about GMO studies and the potential public safety elements for consumer. We've been using GMOs for decades in South Africa, so I believe there isn't sort of that real risk. However, from the consumer's perspective and their choice and the right to be informed, many consumers might, for their own reasons, not want to consume GMOs. And then it's very important that something which is not internationally regarded as a GMO should not be labeled as a GMO product in South Africa.
Absolutely.
No, absolutely. So it's just, to move away from, I guess, the tainted reputation of GMOs. And, if this goes down the wrong wormhole, then unfortunately, and the way it is playing out, I think, in South Africa, there's a very real risk that our consumers will associate anything that comes from NBTs also as a GMO. And we don't want to, because, consumers at the end of the day are going to be at the disadvantage in terms of not being able to access and enjoy that technology. Yeah.
So lastly, what would be the ideal outcome after after everything's been said and done? What would be the ideal outcome for NBTs when we look at agriculture specifically and the broader society in general? What would you say?
Okay, I would say that, we are not asking, I think, for the GMO Act to be scrapped. It's a functional piece of legislation. It has worked for us. And so that's not what we're asking. All we are asking is that when it comes to the regulation of NBTs, can there be clarity in terms of the way it should be regulated, and to make that clear, I think, differentiation from where it produces products that are not GMOs. I think also to recognize the science and base the decision on NBT regulation on science, and also to look at it as on a case-by-case basis. I mean, this is the way I think the rest of the world is looking at it, and we are asking just the regulators in South Africa to also, consider those regulatory approaches and look at, case-by-case assessment, so that we are not, misaligned, and I think our lives are just going to become more difficult, if we also don't just look beyond just our own decision, but look at also what the rest of the world is doing.
Yeah, if something, there's a sort of a saying in the industry, if something does not need to be regulated, then it needs to not be regulated, because unnecessary regulation and red tape, it's a huge disincentive, an obstacle to business. So essentially, directly speaking, this appeal, it's not a legal process, it's an administrative process. So, there was this decision made, and it's just an internal appeal to ask the minister, as the principal of that legislation, to reconsider that decision, to regulate, the blanket approach at the moment, to regulate all NBTs as GMOs, to reconsider that and have a science-based approach, exactly like Chantel mentioned.
Well, let's hope we reach the ideal solution to this, because NBTs to me sounds like an absolute win-win for everybody involved. Chantel, Theo, thank you very much for joining me and discussing this very interesting topic. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.